let's move forward with the rest of our lecture, and we're going to introduce some terms that give us knowledge about directions and locations of anatomical structures. Okay, we're ready to start describing some directions, and so we'll start with two simple directions. If I'm going to describe a body and I put an arrow like this, as we have a person, and you'll have to excuse my art, but a person standing, and I have here labeled thumbs out. I'm going to describe that in a second. But if we have a person standing in front of us, or even if they're lying face up or in the supine position, we can describe this direction and this direction here with the terms superior, meaning above, and inferior, meaning below. So, for example, this is a person named Tom. Tom's nose is superior to Tom's left foot. Conversely, Tom's right foot and left foot are both inferior to Tom's nose. Now, it's important when we talk about these directions that we have a normal reference position. And we call that normal reference position, we call that anatomical position. Let me give you an example. If Tom bent over and he took his thumb and he put it underneath his foot, now those directions wouldn't make sense. So when we talk about a body, we have to have a reference position that we reference or use to describe structures that are superior or inferior, and that will work all the time. So anatomical position is a position when we have a human specimen. It is a position where the specimen is standing, feet and hands forward, or I should say palms, head facing the front or forward, and most importantly, arms at the side, and again, palms facing forward. We could say standing erect or standing tall. That describes anatomical positions. So the position of a person standing erect, feet, palms, head, all facing forward, arms are at the side. You could say that the feet are slightly apart. That would be another good portion to add. Now, think about this. If the palms are facing the front or facing forward, that means that the person's thumbs are facing outward, right? Now, we all know we could stand with our arms at our sides with our palms facing the back as well, but that's not anatomical position. So it's very important, and in fact, let me just highlight this, that the palms are facing forward, which means the thumbs are facing away from the body. We're going to use another term to describe that in just a second. Now, going down, we still have the person in anatomical position, except we're looking at them from the side. If we were to describe structures toward the front, we use the term anterior. And if we were to describe structures facing the back or toward the back, we would say that they're posterior. Again, we can use the term superior and the term inferior here as well. Now, we'll add a couple more in blue. If you were to look at structures toward the midline, we describe the structures as being medial. And structures away from the midline, we'd use the term lateral. Medial meaning toward the midline, lateral meaning away from the midline. Away from the midline. So those are some really important terms: superior and inferior, anterior and posterior, and medial and lateral. Sometimes you'll hear the term ventral and dorsal. In fact, you've probably heard the term dorsal before if you know anything about fish, right? The dorsal fin of a dolphin, for example. Okay? All right. And so anterior, another term that we use sometimes is ventral. Has slightly different meanings. Sometimes they're used interchangeably. Anterior literally is translated toward the front. Ventral means toward the belly surface. And in bipeds, people that or organisms that walk on two legs, right? Ventral works just fine. And for posterior, sometimes we use dorsal to refer towards the surface of one's back. Now that works fine for you and I, but for quadrupeds, and I'll give you a quadruped here. I don't know how great it's going to be. Still deciding if it's a sheep or a dog. I think it's the dog from the Doggy Dentures commercial. There we go. So here's a quadruped. And so in a quadruped, this is anterior, whereas this is ventral. And this is posterior, whereas this is dorsal. So while those terms are interchangeable in bipeds, they're not necessarily interchangeable in quadrupeds. Dorsal would also work with superior here as well, right? In the quadruped. Of course, this is a human anatomy and physiology course, so these terms are the terms that we are going to focus on here. I just bring the term dorsal and ventral into light for you because they are not quite the same definition. Okay. This is a really good place to stop. We'll pick up with our next video when we describe now planes, and then we'll talk about regions and cavities. Two last directional terms that I would like to describe to you are the terms, or I should say four last terms, are proximal and distal and superficial and deep. In fact, if we were to use a diagram like this, and we were to describe or use these terms proximal and distal, and I'm going to use generic terms for you, I would describe the fingers on a body as being distal compared to the elbow. So I would say fingers are distal to the elbow. I could also say the phalanges are distal to the cubital region and the antecubital region. That's another way of saying the same thing. What do you think that term distal means then? Distal actually means further from the site of attachment. And we typically use distal and proximal when we describe the appendages or the extremities. Let's use proximal in a sentence. The elbow is proximal to the wrist. That means that it's closer to the point of origin. Where's the point of origin? Well, it's right here at the axillary region, or the armpit, or the shoulder. Okay? How about superficial and deep? I bet you know these quite well. In fact, if we were to draw a picture of a needle, let's draw a picture of a needle being injected into our patient. This is a gigantic needle. What direction, as we push the needle into the patient, which direction do you think we move? I hope you're thinking that when we inject a needle into a patient, we move from superficial to deep. Superficial surfaces are structures that are along the surface. Deep structures are away from the surface. So we would say that the epidermis of the skin is a superficial structure compared to the underlying muscles, which are deep.